This is U.S. History Regents Review, Unit 4, video number 2. We were just finishing up talking about one of the progressive era reforms, which was with the goal of increasing the average power of an average citizen in elections in local government. So these are kinds of democratic reforms. So the last one I needed to talk about was the 17th Amendment. This is a big one. This is an amendment to the Constitution, a change to the Constitution, which allowed people to directly vote for their senators. It used to be that state legislatures picked out who would be their senator. But now, ever since the 17th Amendment, you, the average voter, can vote for who your senators are going to be. So again, the goal is to increase the power of the people and to make a more democratic government. Now, there are also problems in the cities that the progressives wanted to fix. In particular, one of their big concerns were tenements. Tenements are these crowded urban houses where usually several immigrant families would live in these really awful conditions. And they almost were completely centered in New York City because people would immigrate here, go through Ellis Island, and then if they knew family already who lived in the area, they would go live in these ethnic enclaves. So maybe all the Italians are living together, all the Jewish families are living together. And there are just certain parts of New York City that were mainly occupied by tenements and immigrants. So Jacob Reese is a journalist, and he decides he wants the public to know what's going on with these tenements. So he documented poor living conditions through photos in his book, How the Other Half Lives. And he introduced the middle class to the problems that were happening. And his book has a really big impact, and it leads to a lot of changes. There's a Tenement Housing Act that is passed in New York State to set standards for what tenements had to be like. And in general, there's improved sanitation, infrastructure, higher standards of living for these tenements. Another person who played a really big role in trying to help those in cities, and especially immigrants, was this woman named Jane Addams. She's a very famous progressive reformer, and she's well known for her role in the settlement house movement. Now, the goal of a settlement house is to create opportunities for people in poor working class neighborhoods to get jobs, training, education, childcare, and maybe some English skills. So there's a lot of these settlement houses that are put in many poor neighborhoods of major cities. And Jane Addams, her most famous one was in Chicago. It's called Hull House. Consumer protection is a big concern. There were dangerous products that threatened the health of average Americans. One example that is both funny and sad is down here. Cocaine, toothache drops, instantaneous cure. Yes, if you give this to your child, they will stop crying. There were openly dangerous products that people understood was related to addiction, but were still sold on shelves. This is also when patent medicines were popular. So you would just buy a bottle of something from a store that promised to help you feel better. And usually it was mostly filled with alcohol. But again, consumers did not necessarily know what kinds of products were available. So one of the most important muckrakers that we have is Upton Sinclair. He wrote a book called The Jungle. And this book described some really disgusting conditions of meatpacking plants. And people read this book and they freaked out. One of the people who read this book and was horrified was Theodore Roosevelt. And he responded by passing laws to improve conditions for consumers. The first one was the Meat Inspection Act, which improved conditions of the meatpacking industry by requiring inspections, and the Pure Food and Drug Act. This is a really important law that required truth in labeling, including things like listing the ingredients in medicine or food. And later is going to kind of paved the path for what becomes the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Monopolies had incredible power over the government and the economy. If you take a look at this political cartoon, this is showing Rockefeller holding what is the government, the White House, in the palm of his hand. In the back, we have the Capitol building, Congress. It's like looking like a factory. This is showing you the incredible power of people like Rockefeller over our government and our economy. Presidents began to try to increase competition by breaking up trusts. They recognized that not all trusts serve the interests of the American people. This political cartoon shows you Theodore Roosevelt being the first to really take on these massive trusts. And his goal was to distinguish between good trusts and bad trusts. In his opinion, not all trusts are bad. You should kill the ones that are bad, but leave alone the ones that are good and okay. And this is why Theodore Roosevelt and then right after him, President Taft, become known as trust busters. They use or try to use the Sherman Antitrust Act to try to break up trusts. I will mention again, Sherman was not that effective, but eventually the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed by Wilson, which was more effective. The Interstate Commerce Commission also at this point had been created to try to regulate the railroad industry. And then Wilson later created the Federal Trade Commission to stop unfair methods of competition and to actually enforce the Clayton Antitrust Act. So trusts are being busted up by all three of these progressive presidents. Meanwhile, workers are fighting for their rights. They're fighting against these huge corporations. Big businesses at this time had opposed labor unions. They opposed workers struggling for better pay, hours, and working conditions. One of the really significant events for most Americans when we think about workers' rights, one of the big tragedies was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. This was in a middle-class neighborhood, New York City. It was this factory that was supposed to be a step up from some of the more awful factories and sweatshops. It was a modern factory. And yet, because of the terrible safety conditions, failed fire safety conditions, it led to the death of 146 people, mostly young women who very publicly either burned to death or jumped out of the windows. And this was so horrifying for everyone who was around to witness it that day. And it led to people calling for better protection for workers. The same women who died in the fire, a lot of them had been in a major labor strike just a couple years beforehand. So people knew that things were not good. People knew that they had complained, and now here they were dead. So, in response to this, people in general, and the movement had been gaining some steam, start to pass laws to protect workers. And what workers really wanted, this is one of their famous kind of rallying cries, was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will. People wanted the 8-hour workday. And states started passing laws establishing minimum wages, workers' comp, 8-hour workday, and finally outlawing child labor, setting minimum age standards for who can work. So these are big victories. They don't happen at this point at a national level, but individual states are taking on these laws and trying to improve conditions in their states. One of the Supreme Court cases that addresses workers' rights is Mueller versus Oregon. This court case decision was that working hours would be limited for women on the basis that women needed special protection. This is a controversial Supreme Court case because to some people, this was a step in the right direction for providing protections for all workers. However, a lot of women also saw this as just an instance of sex discrimination that is now legalized, saying that women are inherently different and need some sort of special protection. So a lot of women did not really feel like this was a victory in terms of equality, but others were happy that it provided more rights and protections in the workplace. So, a very controversial court case.